Obrigada.
When you're ready,
Yes, yes, and it goes until what time now?
wait.
Because we are not starting at 10. I don't mind speaking less, but I just want to see what I'm expected to do.
12, lunch.
12 lunch, so,
Yeah?
okay.
Okay, if you want, you can pass some minutes because we're going to start like 15 minutes. Okay. Bom dia. Bom dia a todas. Ah, desculpa. Okay. I'm going to some institutional video.
Okay. Ah, okay, before,
Remember
like we did
yes-
yesterday, yes, yes.
Ok. Bom dia a todas e a todos. Vamos dar continuidade hoje a mais um dia da nossa Summer School, promovida pelo Nufa e pela Archai. É um prazer estar aqui apresentando para vocês a nossa convidada, a professora Balla, para hoje dar continuidade aos trabalhos na sua segunda aula, que é intitulada On Nomos and Physis. Professora Balla, professora da Universidade de Creta. É um prazer recebê-la aqui novamente, mais um dia. And thank you, Chloe.
Thank you.
Okay.
You can, I can start, or do you have the video?
No,
We will skip this. Yeah, okay, good. Okay, good morning, everyone. I gave you an outline. Most of you were here yesterday. Officially, the talk, my presentation was on greed, but today it will be a follow-up on this. So what I did yesterday was to present also the overview of my 4 lectures, and I explained what my take on the sophists is, focusing a lot on how Plato's philosophical or professional also agenda often prevents us from appreciating the original context in which the sophistic ideas arose. So today I will turn to some of the very well-known texts that, as I said yesterday, are often thought of as reflecting or crystallizing sophistic ideas, which come from Plato, however. And one of them is the second book of the Republic, the Ring of Gyges story, and the argument there that is described often as Glaucon's challenge. And the other is Callicles' speech in the Gorgias. But before I do that, and realizing that On Nomos and Physis can be a little obscure as a description of a talk for people who are not Hellenists, I will say a few things about this contrast. And how do I do this? Okay. This is from Richard Bett's chapter, Nature and Norms, in the recent volume by Josh Billings and Christopher Moore. And I'm reading it, and I will be making some comments. So physis, the term that we translate as nature, is related to the verb phio. There is no equivalent in, like generate, the basic meaning of which is to grow, or be born. And physis itself can sometimes be used in the sense birth or origin. But the perfect tense of the verb, pefyke, expressing the state that has resulted from such growth or birth, can often simply mean be, with a strong suggestion, however, that this being is due to a process in the world independent of any human intervention. And this makes sense of the more common uses of the noun physis, where nature is usually the best one-word translation. At the beginning of the second book of his Physics, Aristotle says that things that exist by nature, by contrast with artifacts, are those with their own source of motion. And it's interesting to think of Aristotle because he needs to go out of his way to define what physis is in the work on the physics. And when we talk about the sophists' contribution to that, we forget that physis was not a trivial concept. So that's good to take into account when we try to think of what is developed as the contrast between nature and norms, physis and law. Moving specifically to the human sphere, he says, Aristotle, at the beginning of the Politics, and that's something we referred to yesterday, that what each thing is, like when it's coming into being, is completed, we call the physis of each thing. I'm sorry, what each thing is like when it's coming into being is completed, we call that the physis of each thing. And on this basis, he famously declares that the human being is by nature a political animal. I didn't talk about this yesterday, but it's very interesting, and I don't know what we can make out of this, that Protagoras in the Great Speech, and in general Protagoras, doesn't seem to rely on the nomos physis contrast. He talks about physis, but never contrasts the two. And that fits the interpretation I followed yesterday, that there is no contrast, really, since what I wanted to suggest yesterday was that Protagoras already anticipates Aristotle's conception of the human nature as political. Nomos, on the other hand, can refer to written law, but also to customs or conventions not spelled out in an explicit prescription. However, prescriptiveness of some kind is central to the notion of nomos, most generally, and nomos specifies something that is supposed to be done, and in a more or less functional society actually is done most of the time. But the source of this prescription is not necessarily society itself, it's not necessarily society itself, while I think we should bear in mind that much of the discussion about nomos we have from 5th century is a criticism on the fact that nomoi are made by humans and they're made to serve their own interests. But before that is becoming a thing in the 5th century, as also part of the branding of popular government or democracy, as we were saying yesterday, nomos has a different, it's always respected. So it can come from God, like it will come with Plato afterwards. But the source of these descriptions is not necessarily society itself, as I was saying, and in the pre-sophistic period, nomos frequently refers to some kind of suprahuman law. And that's, as I said, it's important to bear it in mind when we think of Protagoras' homo mensura. It's only humans that will make everything, including laws. But then you have a problem, because laws can change, and maybe they can be challenged, and maybe they are not just. In Hesiod, it originates from Zeus. It applies to humans and governs how humans should administer justice, but its source is divine. Again, when we compare this stage with Plato, we must think that gods can err also, right? They are not as perfect as gods are in Plato's system. And let me remind you of Heraclitus saying that all the human laws are fed by the one divine law, Pindar, nomos, king of all, mortal and immortal. And what exactly Pindar means is very debatable. And of course, Sophocles' Antigone, that could be the material of another seminar. I'm looking for you, but you're here. Okay. So it's good to bear this in mind when we approach this argument that Glaucon, now Glaucon is, I remind you, the brother of Plato. And I'm saying that because I'm sure that you all remember that in Plato's Republic, the first book is this conversation between, or this fight rather, between Thrasymachus and Socrates, and we will be turning to Thrasymachus on Thursday. But from book 2 onwards, what we have is the brother of Plato, who sometimes, in fact, described in a way that would fit Plato himself, the son of Ariston, who wants Socrates to give him an answer to a concern or to a challenge that thousands of people will share, endorse. We were talking about Thucydides yesterday. So at least the way I see it is that this worry was in the air, that if you have Gyges' ring, you will use it. So what is the polis going to do about that? So I'm reading this. I'm sure you've read it before, but I'm reading it so that you remember how it goes. That's Glaucon. You see, people do say that to commit an injustice is naturally good, while to be the victim of it is bad. Perfykene, which is the past, what do you call it, of the verb phiomai. So it has been crystallized, let's say established, that adikein is agathon, to de adikeistai kakon. Yet being wronged is much more of a bad thing than committing wrong is a good thing. The result of this is that whenever people wrong each other and are also victims of wrong and have a taste of both sides, those who are unable to avoid the one or achieve the other believe that it is in their interest to make a mutual agreement. So that's the first statement of a social contract, which, however, is introduced as a bad bargain. You cannot do anything, so you better agree, like a mafia thing. Yeah, it's not something that you're proud of. From this basis, they begin to make laws and covenants with each other, and they give the terms legal and just, so these are just names, to what is laid down by the law. This is indeed the origin and essence of justice, lying between what is best, to commit wrong with impunity, and what is worse, not being able to get revenge when wronged. So justice, being midway between these two, is welcomed not as a good thing, but is valued through our being too weak to commit an injustice. For anyone who had the power to do wrong and was a real man would never make a compact with anybody not to inflict justice on each other. He would be mad to do so. And it's, we can make a lot of associations about international politics right now. And then it's tempting to compare this challenge that Glaucon sets to Socrates to what Callicles says in Plato's Gorgias. Callicles is the student of, well, the host of Gorgias, an admirer of Gorgias. And what Plato is doing by attributing to him this speech, I think, is that he shows how this open-ended universe of the values of the sophists can produce the kind of monster that Callicles seems to be. But I suppose the makers of the laws are the weaker sort of men and the more numerous. So it is with a view to themselves and their own interests that they make their laws and distribute their praises and censures. So no claim of a divine origin. Anything goes. Whoever is sovereign can make their own laws. And to terrorize a stronger sort of folk who are able to get an advantage and to prevent them from getting one over them, the pleonexia, the greed, they tell them that such aggrandizement is foul and unjust, and that wrongdoing is just this endeavor to get the advantage of one's neighbors. for I expect they are well content to see themselves on an equality when they are so inferior. I will probably not read the whole thing because I believe you're familiar with it, and I can distribute the PowerPoint, and I will just read the last sentence, which is very emblematic. For by what manner of right did Xerxes march against Greece, or his father against Scythia? Okay, might makes right. This is what we saw in Thucydides when we started yesterday. But my claim is going to be that this is not a positive doctrine that you find in any of the sophists, even including Antiphon, which most people wouldn't agree with me on, but we can discuss this. So, one source that I find very interesting and important for my argument is this statement by Aristotle in his Sophistic Refutations, where he explicitly describes the nomos physis contrast as a topos, a commonplace rule, which makes men utter paradoxes in abundance, and that's what Callicles does. That's what Callicles is represented as applying in the Gorgias, and which all the ancients regarded as valid. For according to them, nature and law are opposites, and justice is a good thing according to law, but not according to nature. So I think that Aristotle is downplaying the importance of this contrast, and he describes it as a topos that professional experts in language could use, and he associates it with Callicles, which of course does not surprise us because, as we just saw, it is Callicles who presents this argument. And many scholars would agree that Callicles is fabricated by Plato. I mean, even if he is a historical figure, it's Plato who gives him this very striking argument. But look now at a detail that people sometimes miss. Because before Callicles introduces his argument, which we isolate usually and we then project on the sophists, it is Callicles who criticizes Socrates for using Aristotle's commonplace rule of opposing nomos to physis. And that's what Socrates does when he refutes Polus before. So Callicles says, Socrates, I think you are acting like an adolescent in your speeches, like a regular mob orator. So he's accusing Socrates of employing the tricks of the sophists. And now you're making this harangue with Polus when Polus has suffered the same fate for which he blamed Gorgias, being ashamed at the end, for allowing to happen in his encounter with you. See, in reality, Socrates, while claiming to be pursuing truth, you introduce such vulgar and popular notions as these, things that are not found by nature but by convention. And that's what triggers Callicles' challenge to Socrates. Now, why is it that Socrates can be associated, or why is it that Plato gives Socrates this role of using that topos, that commonplace rule of nomos physis? We had this discussion yesterday about how Plato presents Socrates, and I'm prepared to argue that he doesn't identify him with the sophists, but he puts him somewhere in the middle between the sophistic education and what Plato is seriously undertaking. So I think that Plato wants to admit, and I think this is a good strategy, that yes, people could mistake Socrates for a sophist, for someone who used this trope, this rule, the commonplace rule of the nomos physis contrast. And why would people do that? Who is the first to do that? It is Aristophanes in the Clouds. And you may be familiar with this part, which is it comes in the weak argument of the Clouds. Let me remind you very briefly that the Clouds is a story of a man who owes a lot of money. People are asking him to give them back, to pay the money back, and he comes up with this idea of taking his son, making him a lawyer, and sending him to argue that it's unfair for him to pay the debt. So what Aristophanes does is he's playing, I suppose, with something that was in the air, that sophists could make things look the opposite from what they really are. Philosophers often say that what really is what philosophers are worried about. So for the general public, this was maybe the first exposure to such ideas. The general public also thought that the philosophers were probably useless guys, very pale. They wouldn't go to the agora, just worry about, as I said, we discussed it yesterday also, things that had nothing to do with the polis, falling into wells, so crazy guys, including Socrates. On Friday, we will read this beautiful passage from the Birds where Socrates is, I was referring to it yesterday again, summoning the souls, the spirits from another world. So bizarre, guys. What does Socrates do? He does what Protagoras is said to do. He can show how the weak argument can be turned into a strong argument. I remind you, but I will not have time to talk about this, that it is very interesting to see in Thucydides, for instance, how such techniques are part of diplomacy or of how you reach an agreement between two opposed parties. But Aristophanes' satire makes this look like more ridiculous, so he makes the weak argument. Some people think that it was even in the form of two cocks fighting one another, the weak argument and the strong argument, or the weak logos and the strong logos. And what Aristophanes says that the weak logos suggests is, and this is the first, I think, the earliest case of the implicit use of the antithesis between physis and nomos in the way that is important in the sophistic tradition. So I'm reading. I'll proceed to the necessities of nature, tates physeos anankas. Say you slip up, fall in love, engage in a little adultery, and then get caught. You're done because you're unable to argue. Adynatos gar e legein. So you cannot use language in an effective way. But if you follow me, go ahead and indulge your nature. Romp, laugh, think nothing shameful. Emoide omilon krote phusei, so indulge in your own nature. Gela nomize miden aiskron. So don't give in to norms. Forget about norms or laws. If you happen to get caught in flagrante, tell him this, that you've done nothing wrong. So you can argue for this. Is it Socrates who's arguing this? No, but yes also, because he's the one who teaches the poor father's son the skill of turning the weak argument into a strong one. Now, why is it that Socrates is mixed up or presented as a sophist in the Clouds? Short answer, we don't know. Why is it that Aristophanes is brilliant in associating Socrates not with Protagoras, but with implicitly, let's say, the nomos physis contrast? Because Socrates, everyone would know, is a student of Archelaus. And that's from Diogenes Laertius, Archelaus of Athens or of Miletus. His father was Apollodorus, or as some say Medon, disciple of Anaxagoras, teacher of Socrates. This man was the first to transfer natural philosophy from Ionia to Athens, and he was called a natural philosopher. We don't know much about Archelaus. Gabor Betech in Cambridge works on him, and I'm indebted to his work also. He has an article on his presence in the clouds. And why is now Archelaus associated with this nomos physis thing? Again, some source that says how natural philosophy stops with Archelaus, and it is Socrates who introduces ethics. Again, we don't know much about Archelaus. We know nothing about Socrates in a sense, but his students have made him into a huge philosopher. Socrates then is presented as a student of Archelaus. And what did Archelaus argue? He also philosophized about laws and what is fine and just. What is just and what is shameful, he said, exist not by nature but by convention. Kaito dikaion eina kaito aiskron, ou physei ala nomo. I think it's a very compelling argument to think that this lies in the background of Aristophanes' persona of Socrates. People could recognize that Socrates was endorsing and implementing this contrast for his arguments, and it made sense that he was a student of Archelaus. What I would be skeptical about is that Archelaus really anticipates the kind of argument we find in Callicles. I mean, to say that nomoi differ from physis, and that human beings are responsible for making them, there is nothing divine there, is in a very positive way a Protagorean view. We are here to discuss what we want to stipulate as laws, as rules. This doesn't come from the gods. This is enlightenment. We are very pleased that this is the case. This is Athenian democracy. But look how now people are become more skeptical about it. And they say, look, what are the implications here? You have someone like Socrates who, yes, and this is a bonus text, because I will not be talking about this, but this is a great topic. Archelaus also said, God is air and mind, but mind is not what made the world. And this is a parenthesis now, which shows how Archelaus' background could be very relevant to the story of Socrates' trial and to the Phaedo, to Plato's project in the Phaedo, trying to show how Socrates, God forbid, was not a materialist. But I'm going back to the nomos physis business. Remember how Plato in the Apology says that there are some older accusers who present Socrates as an intellectual, a theorist about the firmament, an investigator of everything that lies beneath the earth, and one who makes the weaker argument the stronger. Sophos aner ta temeteora frontestes, kai ta hypoges panda anezetikos, kai ton hetologon kreito pion. So, according to Plato, that's what made the Athenians be so aggressive toward Socrates. Big story. I don't know if you agree. I'm very skeptical about that. But I think it makes sense. It's useful to keep it in mind when we understand how, for Plato, it is very interesting to show why this was not the case. Even if the Athenians didn't care too much about that. I don't know if they care too much about that. But for Plato, this, I think, shapes much of his own agenda. Now, look how close the teaching of Socrates is to that kind of argument. It's not Socrates who's teaching, it's the son of Phaidippides, Strepsiades, who says in the clouds, to justify why he's about to beat up his father. So Socrates challenging the morality, the traditional morality, first of all, telling the Athenians that teachers are more important than the parents. Again, a very good idea, I believe, as a teacher. So, and what's the monster that he produces, Socrates, in the Frontisterion, in this thinkery? Wasn't the man who established the law, nomos, in the first place someone like you and me? Didn't he rely on his own words to persuade people back then? Then why can't I establish my own law, that in future sons can beat their fathers in return? As for the blows we received before the law was established, we drop our claims for compensation and in a gesture of goodwill offer them up free, gratis, and for nothing. Consider the beasts of the air, physis, and all other creatures, the way they get their own back on their parents. We can think of Protagoras, of course, here saying, yes, but they are different kinds of animals. We are political. Yet how are they different from us? Yet, well, apart from the fact that they don't propose legislation. So proposing legislation, this is of course comedy, and it's a great line, is presented as a perversion of human beings, something that humans do in their spare time. They argue, and they change their views on what is right. And what I find very interesting is that in Xenophon's Memorabilia, we have Hippias, who is in the Protagoras, and we will see this in a moment, presented as a supporter of the nomos physis contrast. He says that we are all by nature syngenes, a family, or the sophoi, or the wise men, and it is only nomos that makes us look different. So Hippias is the one who here challenges again the laws, the value of the laws. That's in a very interesting conversation he has with Socrates. And this is the chapter in which Socrates introduces, in Xenophon, the idea of unwritten or divine law, not natural law, not law of nature, unwritten or divine law. And the examples he gives there is something that has to do with incest, that if you commit incest, then the kids from this relationship will not have good health, basically because of the difference in age between the two parents. Bizarre argument. And the other one is that of an unwritten law, a case of an unwritten law or divine law, that you have to return the charis, to return what you receive from people, and to be friends. How are you friends with people? If you're not good with them, they will not be good with you, and that's not a good idea. So it's better, and that's not natural. This is unwritten or divine. And the reason why I'm mentioning these examples is that I find it interesting that nature is not entering the story there, because I don't think that Xenophon has the toolkit to deal with it, or he's interested to do that yet. So Socrates, who says that I'm always with the law, in that, and what is your definition of what is justice? He says to go to Xenophon. Do you understand what is meant by the laws of the city? Socrates said, yes, I do, Hippias said. And what do you think that these are? What the citizens, he said, have written down after having made an agreement about what people must do and what they must refrain from. So no big deal. And Hippias said, Socrates, how could someone consider either the laws or obedience to them to be something worth taking seriously given that the very people who establish them often reject and change them. So this is attributed to Hippias, and it is likely that someone like Hippias could have said it. Why? Because we see this kind of objection as part of the criticism to Athenian democracy in the last decades of the 5th century. Why? Because more and more people complain that those sitting in the assembly will pass laws in their own interests. Maybe you're familiar with pseudo-Xenophonting text on the Constitution of the Athenians, known as the Old Oligarch, a very fun, sophisticated text which says basically they're doing a great job. They're destroying everything. They're passing laws in their own interest. They have these institutions that do everything they want. So this is in the air as a criticism of popular government. Does it mean that we don't need any laws? I wouldn't go that far, but the contrast between law and physis can help you argue in this way. What I want to suggest, however, here is that Xenophon, not to suggest, to point out that Xenophon attributes to Hippias the same argument that Aristophanes made Socrates almost endorse. Why are laws important? And Xenophon is able then, just as Plato is trying to do also, to show how Socrates, far from endorsing these amoralistic ideas that Aristophanes associated him with, had answers to these challenges. Xenophon tells his own story, making Socrates invoke unwritten law and saying how he always does what the laws command, and if they change, that's okay, Socrates says. So it's Hippias who says what Socrates' student Pheidippides had argued in the Clouds, and Socrates is able to answer that. And likewise with Callicles. Callicles challenges Socrates. Socrates has an answer to that. Look, says Plato, he was not like what you had in Aristophanes. And this is the text from Hippias. Hippias the wise said, that's from Protagoras, you gentlemen who are present here in Callias' house for the discussion between Socrates and Protagoras, I consider that you all belong to the same family, syngenes, household and city, by nature, physis, not by convention, nomos. For what is similar belongs by nature to the same family, syngenes, as what is similar, whereas convention, which is a tyrant over men, commits violence upon many things against nature. Now, let's stop and reflect. Is this a statement against nomoi in general, as Guthrie, I guess, would argue? Is this challenging, or is it suggesting that we don't care about nomoi? It's interesting, of course, to see how these questions anticipate Stoic natural law at the end of the day. And it's interesting to consider how the Stoics looked at Xenophon Socrates for inspiration for that. But what we have here is way too fragmentary. And when we place it in its context, I think, we realize that these guys were not anarchists. They were critical and they were interested to discuss how, what are the constraints of laws, who passes them. We will talk about Thrasymachus in the first book of the Republic, who is going to say at the end, I mean not at the end, at the beginning of the Republic, that justice is what each sovereign body stipulates as its laws and institutions. This is a challenge that some people would associate with, even with Socrates. It has to do a lot with criticism of the democracy, but it does not mean that nomos is out of the question, or that you prefer tyranny or monarchy, or that you have a theory about it. Therefore, Hippias says, it would be disgraceful for us to know the nature of things. We, who are the wisest of the Greeks and have come together now to the city that is in Greece, the town hall itself of wisdom, that's Athens, in that city itself, to this house, the greatest and most wealthy one it contains, but not to produce anything that would be worthy of this honor, but instead to quarrel with one another like the most vulgar of men. I understand this as an epideixis, that Hippias wants to throw this show and say, stop quarreling, we are a club here. It's a little anti-democratic also. We had this discussion yesterday. These are rich guys who can afford to pay this, so we belong in a club. So please stop quarreling and see what we, the wisest people, can agree on. Now let me, before I turn to antiphon, let me wait for questions, or if you want to discuss something so far. Yes, please, Gabriela.
Just a very brief clarification. So, in the previous slides, the Hippias, are they suggesting that democracy could be something natural by the physics? I got it right. Like,
that democracy is something natural, physis. I've never thought about this.
like an argument pro-democracy from these guys saying, you know, this is not a convention. We are syngenes. And the syngeneia is like an argument for the democracy.
What do I think now? It sounds Protagorean. Is that what you mean? Yes, that all human beings can be part of this discussion. And that's what we end up doing. It's difficult because we do it with us traveling like sophists from one conference to another, discussing and becoming a community that has no legal, of course, can do nothing. But we are friends, which is nice. Yeah, I mean, one could fantasize about cosmopolitanism, and it's interesting to project this to see how this is used in Stoicism, because what you have there, it's the sophoi. So again, not much of a democracy, because not everyone could be part of it. I mean, nobody would be a sophos, right? So you don't get much. But as an argument, I think I see what you mean. I wouldn't say that this is part of Hippias' agenda, though. I think that Hippias is critical of the fact that anyone can go to the assembly and vote for whatever they want without having any expertise, as Plato would say. Protagoras would then say, yes, they don't have expertise, but I do, and I am the kind of person that can teach them the good judgment, euboulia, and this can remedy the problem, and we don't have another option, Protagoras would say, as many of us, I hope, still say that we don't have a better option than democracy. Yeah. Please, yes.
Just to point out that probably this nomos physis was something more popular in the mind of everyone, because I'm thinking of Antigone.
Yeah.
Where he states, well, the big problem is exactly this duality between the nomos and the laws of nature, the laws of the gods. There's
Unwritten laws.
the unwritten laws that there's a kind of hierarchy. So those were, she says something like, I wouldn't think that the laws of a man would surpass the laws of a god. And so there is this, thank you. So I think this duality is very much on the topic of discussions as democracy becomes more radical and more inclusive. So only to suggest that maybe it's not such a specialized argument, and maybe it is more of a popular one.
Yes, and I'm glad you're raising this, because obviously before democracy became a problem, before it started being, and it's a good thing. I mean, it's problematized, as we say, and people worry about democracy being reduced to populism. And the way we know the discussion is, of course, from those who are the critics of democracy, and there is so much literature on that, and very interesting one. And I said yesterday that we only have an insider's information via Protagoras, maybe, or the Athpol of Aristotle. But we don't know what the Athenians thought. We know that Aristophanes presents them as people who would go and get their per diem and make money out of this. We saw yesterday the randomizing machine, which shows that people were doing this. They were practicing this. So it's hard to tell how explicit this was, if people worried. I think we should filter a lot of this with realizing that it's people who are critical of the democracy who are saying this, or intellectuals who worry about that. Can they propose something better? Is what Plato proposes something better? I understand the counterpart of this is something on the politeia that you have been discussing. People say that Plato is an enemy of the democracy. I have said it myself. People in Greece hate that. I almost lost my job by saying this, because Plato is our hero, and the Greeks always love democracy, and I have no idea what these guys thought. But anyway, but thinking about this in a more sober way, what Plato suggests is education. So not everyone should vote, but the ones who are educated enough. And we are now in a situation where we can appreciate that, because when everyone votes and what they have been exposed to is social media texts and no critical thinking, then things can go wrong. So at the end of the day, what's good about this is that our disciplines become more useful at the end. I'm not sure I answered. I think we agree, though, that this is a general thing. But I think it is interesting to bear in mind the connection with Archelaus, for Aristophanes, for the way people thought about this challenge as a Socratic problem, not associated only with Socrates maybe, but for Plato, I think it is an important vantage point. Yeah, Fernanda, yes.
I had the impression that you stressed a difference between natural law and unwritten law and law that came from the gods. So I was curious why you stressed this difference and how it fits to your argument.
Yes, I mentioned this in connection to memorabilia, that it's very intriguing to ask the question, why is it that Xenophon, when he attributes to Socrates an argument in favor of unwritten or divine law, says nothing but does not put nature in the discussion. And it's even more intriguing to realize that he does not associate Hippias with this, despite the fact that in other sources, like in Plato, we see Hippias being interested in this distinction. So natural law is something that Xenophon knows nothing about, right? That comes much later. And we can understand by looking at Xenophon why the Stoics get interested in this argument, because Socrates just gives two examples of ways in which nature regulates in a providential way, I guess. And what does it regulate about? Monstrosities of children, childbirth, so that you don't commit incest. I mean, it's just two examples of unwritten law. So I think that Xenophon either doesn't think about it, or that Socrates didn't think about it, or he doesn't, or it's a taboo. I mean, that he cannot deal with the question of nomos and physis, as Plato is going to do in his works, which turns on a positive alternative of how we understand nature in a more normative way, which can be traced back to the pre-Socratics, maybe, in a way that that is now more elaborate through Plato, how nature can have its own norms, and that's what you have in the Timaeus and in the laws, without, again, using the vocabulary of nomos physis, which is interesting. And the law of nature and natural law are two different things. So the law of nature is what Callicles invokes as a blind force. Nature is a blind force that might makes right, and morality has nothing to do with that, whereas natural law is combining the two, but it's still not there. Did I? Yeah. Yes.
Going back to the original question on human nature, I'm thinking, I was thinking if accepting this contrast between nomos and physis would make a difference in the response, in the answer to the question you made yesterday. The pessimistic point of view of the sophists, of that human nature is greed. Would it make a difference or not? Do you think it would make, because love, the question is love fuel? Fueling.
Yeah.
Could you, would you say that in this contrast, love, for example, would be nature, would be physis, or, you know what I mean? It's very difficult to understand this contrast. What is nomos and what is physis?
Yes.
Education could be natural. The desire of education, the desire
which is what Aristotle says in the beginning of the Metaphysics, that all human beings by nature desire to understand. Yeah. And that's what makes human beings, in this very anthropocentric perspective, different and superior from other animals. And that's what I tried to underline yesterday when I said that for Protagoras, quoting Beresford, humans think in order to live, and for the philosophical tradition that starts with Plato and Aristotle, human beings have the privilege of living in order to think. Of course, this leaves out a lot of human beings, but they don't care about them.
But accepting or not the contrast would make a difference, wouldn't it?
Why?
I don't know. I think so.
Well, I mean, it depends on what do you mean by contrast. I believe
Nomos
that,
versus physis.
right, that when Archelaus says that physis regulates in this way and then nomo in its own way, and that's necessary, and nomoi are made by humans, I'm completely misquoting him. He leaves space for what you have in Protagorean perspective, that humans make their best to stipulate nomoi that will allow them to flourish within societies, which is what humans are made for. Where will those laws come from? The gods. Okay. Plato will say the gods. That this is the line, this is the string that connects us to the gods, he will say, in the laws. Okay, there is even a Protagorean way to deal with this, I think, that this is the divine thing in us, but this does not mean theocracy, and it does not mean, of course, Plato will triumph about fighting relativism, but I don't think that Protagoras was interested in relativism. He was interested in mediating among people to make societies possible and to establish laws. We know that Protagoras, some people don't believe this is a good source, but anyway, that he was sent by Pericles to Thurioi to make the laws. Would the relativists do that? Maybe he would go there and he would say anything goes. On Monday you will have this law, on Tuesday the other one, and let's vote every day. Nobody did that. And no one would, no serious statesman, as I believe Pericles was, would choose Protagoras as an advisor unless he wanted him just to have fun. And you do have this, I mentioned yesterday the example of on the nature of man, which describes those epideixes, those performances, people arguing on different sides, on opposite sides. Maybe Thucydides, or not maybe, for sure Thucydides is part of this culture, and this is what allows him to write in this way and to organize the arguments. And this is the kind of analytic skill that lawyers, as I was saying yesterday, need to have to understand those distinctions. Does this mean that they don't care what they're going to argue for? I'm not going to answer this question. But it is part of what an education in language and speech making and logos and reasoning is about. And that's what I think you have with the sophists. So, along with the thinking for yourself as a human being, which is very enlightening. Other? Okay. I was... there are very interesting sources also that suggest how Herodotus, you know, this story of Herodotus, about how people deal with their dead, and he talks about how important it is from an anthropological perspective to stick to your customs. It's part of your identity, and that's very optimistic and very very progressive, if I may say, we use this word. And very Protagorean also. So before Plato comes around, this contrast could be something that people could think with. And you don't need to reduce everything to nature, because human beings, for human beings, it's very important to have their language, their customs, their rights. And these differ from one society to another. And remember, Socrates was not accused of not believing in gods, but of not accepting nomisdein, again a derivative of nomos, the gods that the community is accepting, worshipping or accepting, really. You remember the beginning of which is an interesting contrast again, the beginning of the Republic. Socrates goes down to Piraeus to see what kind of novelties that the Athenians are introducing, and their trouble was whether Socrates was challenging their gods. Interesting, yeah, point by Plato, I believe. Yes, I mentioned Herodotus, and there is this marvelous text from the Hippocratic collection, the Airs, Waters, Places, which again shows how scientific, let's say, observation allows you to understand the difference between what is natural and what is stipulated by law. And this is done with a lot of open-mindedness. You do not, don't judge people for having different laws. And to go back to Xenophon, what is interesting in the Memorabilia is that when Socrates invokes divine or unwritten law, Hippias, and I tend to think that none of the sophists had any interest in gods as supernatural forces. So Hippias is such a case, I believe. But he says, yes, divine or unwritten. Sure, he says, because if people don't speak the same language, and they all they all accept the same laws, then it must be unwritten, divine. It's beyond what people do because they don't speak the same language. So it happens that they all have the same law. No big deal for Hippias, of course. But so I think he has this empirical way of looking at it. So I now want to turn to Antiphon, and I expect Braga da Silva to have some argument here, and I understand that he will be talking about Antiphon more later in this meeting. So if we isolate, Antiphon is a contemporary of Socrates. There is a discussion. I am sympathetic, as I said yesterday, to Michael Gagarin's reading of thinking of Antiphon as a single author who wrote on truth, but also the tetralogies, so no distinction between the orator and the sophist. Bonazzi has, again, a very good article on concordance, where he talks about Antiphon's views on the importance of education. And we have this, I like Gagarin's argument because it helps us think or speculate about Antiphon as someone who's practicing speech writing in favor and against a given thesis. This is what Protagoras also did. This is what Socrates is represented as doing in the Aristophanes' Clouds. So if you isolate this passage here, what you have is, and this is from Antiphon's On Truth, is something that allows you to go very easily from Antiphon to Glaucon's challenge. If you think of this as part of a debate between the side of nature and the side of nomos, you can have a very different story. And I'm sure you've seen this passage before, but I'm reading it to discuss it with you and to see if I can convince you that this is not on the side of, that Antiphon could not be the person that Glaucon has in mind when he says, Socrates, help me resist this argument. Just as Antiphon says, therefore, it's fragmentary, right? I mean, people put those fragments in different, in a different order, and it makes a big difference what order you accept. Justice is not violating the rules, nomima, of the city in which one is a citizen. Thus, a person would best use justice to his own advantage if he considered the laws, nomoi, important when witnesses are present, but the requirements of nature, physis, important in the absence of witnesses. For the requirements of the laws are supplemental, epitheta, but the requirements of nature are necessary. And the requirements of the laws are by agreement and not natural, whereas the requirements of nature are natural and not by agreement. What kind of argument do we think that this author is endorsing? I mean, it is very tempting to think that it is the kind of argument we see Glaucon presenting to Socrates when he tells him that thousands of people will tell you that if the person who you think of as just now got the same ring that the ring of Gyges, there would be no difference between the absolute unjust man and the absolute just man. And the whole Republic is organized around this antithesis between absolute justice and absolute injustice. So, do we think that this is this can be traced back to Antiphon? And how do we answer this question? I think that the standard view is still that this is in line with Glaucon. But so my objection to this, but I'm ready to hear your disagreement, is that physis is as important as and as challenging a concept as nomos is. And we know that Antiphon is interested in both. We also know that Antiphon is no anarchist. I mean, I think methodologically, even if it's fragmentary, we should take this into account. We should take into account also this skepticism toward democracy, that nomoi change, and maybe it's, I mean, I don't know if you've been following the news, but you know that people are now, this is such a Socratic thing, that people from the American military are accused for disobeying the laws. Huh? This is so Socratic. So what is nomoi? Raising the question doesn't mean that you have to vote whether you like to have nomos or not. But it can suggest that you have a very open-minded perspective, but you can also be critical toward the democracy, which is what happens with Antiphon, because we know that he was part of an oligarchic revolution, and that he had his end was very similar to that of Socrates. So he was no friend of the democracy. What he suggested as an alternative, maybe he didn't suggest anything. He was also a professional speech writer. So a very different profile of what Plato wants us to demand that ticks his boxes of philosophy. Does this mean that he wants us not to respect nomoi? From my perspective, I think he fits this skepticism about whether justice can be reduced to nomoi. And this is something that we still worry about, right? I hope, I guess. But that doesn't mean that we are prepared to say there should be no nomoi, or let's find a charismatic ruler who can save us. And what Plato says in the Republic, and that's what I meant when I said that yes, he's a critic of the Athenian democracy, but on the other hand, we don't have to think of him as conservative as he sometimes is presented, because what he advertises as the biggest value is education. And this makes a difference. And critical thinking, and also an education that allows you to resist natural greed. Because if you're a philosopher, then you know that bodily appetites are nothing compared to the desire of understanding the ideas or mathematics or you name it. But he has the kind of alternative that Plato produces is to this direction. It's not like find a charismatic, and it's not just one, which I find very interesting. It's a group of people, because otherwise, I guess, how are you going to do dialectic if you don't have a group of people? So Antiphon, I didn't bring this text because also I understood that you will be talking about Antiphon more, but he also has the first statement against xenophobia, that by nature, it is by law that we think that some people are higher than some others. It doesn't talk about higher necessarily, but it's possible to see it this way. And that we are barbarian when we think that some people are of a different kind. We are all, by nature, we are all human. Also, he talks about how by law you will end up suing your friend or being a witness against them, and what happens with. So I think it's more about raising paradoxes and also suggesting that this legal positivism is not going to save you. And what's interesting, I referred to this yesterday, is that it is Xenophon who makes Socrates say the exactly same thing in his memorabilia, that justice is obeying the laws of your city. And Hippias says, but this changes all the time. And Socrates says, yes, and people go to war and then they make peace. And that's when you see it in Socrates, you say, that's okay. It's not sophistic. It's Socrates who obeys the laws and who thinks that you cannot have a city without laws. And that's what we all believe, even if we worry that laws can change. And I'm afraid that in this audience, you worry as much as many other people worry about these things these days. So I was also suggesting that when we talked about the myth of about Plato's Protagoras yesterday, that it's misleading to think of the sophists as dealing only with techneton logon, with speech making. They give an education in intriguing things to an audience that can pay to have this kind of performances, mathematical performances, to understand mathematical proof. And it is very interesting sociologically to think of the fact that there were people in Athenian democracy who were willing to give money not to buy an expensive car, not because there were no cars, but because they preferred to give that money to follow a mathematical proof, I guess, or to understand how, if you're left with Plato, you think that it is only Plato who does this, but this is probably not the case. Because you remember the text I referred to yesterday about Protagoras saying that unlike these guys who bring you back to the technai, I will give you something more important and something that nobody else is going to teach you. And this is good judgment. Okay. Now, I just said that Antiphon is a complex personality, I guess, or so I want to think of him. And think of Aristotle's Physics too. Maybe you already know this text. How Aristotle talks about Antiphon. in the context of Aristotle's effort to explain what physis is. In the beginning, I said that when Aristotle writes his physics, he needs to explain, and Richard Bett said that also in this quote, what physis is. It's not a given that it will have its order, its teleology, it will be the source, or it pertains to things that have their own movement. And then in a typically Aristotelian manner, Aristotle invokes sayings, views of important people like Antiphon. Some hold that the nature and substantive existence of natural products have physis kai he ousia ton physei ondon resides in their material, on the analogy of the wood of a bedstead or the bronze of a statue. Of course, to understand this, Aristotle's view, we have to think of the word matter, this concept that comes with Aristotle as one of the four causes. So Aristotle is employing Antiphon's argument in order to make his own fourfold causality, which is form, final cause, efficient cause, and form, more to show that it makes more sense. What's wrong with Antiphon? Antiphon took it as an indication of this, that if a man, so an indication of what? That that physis lies in the material. If a man buried a bedstead and the sap in it took force and threw out a shoot, it would be tree and not bedstead that came up, since the artificial arrangement of the material by the craftsman is merely an incident that has occurred to it. Ten κατανόμων διάτεσιν καί τεν τέχνην, την δουσίαν ούσαν εκείνην he καί διαμένει τauta πάσκουσα συνεχώς. So the idea of the subject that Aristotle is making Antiphon introduce, whereas its essential and natural quality is to be found in that which persists, διαμένει, continuously throughout such experiences. Nothing about the nomos physis contrast, really. I mean, yes, he talks about nomos in the sense of the artificial order that is made by humans. He doesn't say that we don't want people to make beds. He says that it's, I guess, a different thing, that nature is a different thing, and that it is more fundamental. It's something that you cannot change. Too bad, you cannot change that. And that's what Antiphon says in his fragments also. The text is called On Truth, so it is challenging and it is tempting to ask the question, where does truth lie for Antiphon? And some people, I guess, will be willing to say that it lies on the side of physis. Some people will be tempted to say that it lies on the debate, that this is, that you don't have something that is dogmatic, and that what people like Antiphon do by cultivating argumentation can help you understand the antinomy in a way that that is close, I think, to what Aristotle suggests when he places this antinomy in his sophistic refutations. Questions? Yes, please, Renato.
So, I may be bringing something from yesterday as well.
Okay.
So it seems to me that, and correct me if I'm wrong, it seems to me that part of what you are suggesting is that, well, the sophists have, in a way, an idea of human greed as a natural aspect of human nature, and we can overcome that by nomoi, by the use of conventions and the political activity in the polis. So in the political activity, and by the use of language and by the use of argumentation. And on the other hand, it seems to me that you are implying that Plato thinks different. For Plato, nature is related to good, and so we have this connection with other worlds and values and objective values for moral. And there seems to be opposite positions in a way. So my question is, if we understand the Platonic arguments against the sophists, it seems to me that what he's trying to say is that, okay, you think you are doing something that is only political and not natural and not related to the good and the objective truth of ethical values. But if, in fact, if you are talking about eubulia, for example, you are doing it because you depend on those objective values for the ethical discussion.
Yes.
And so I think Plato would present the sophists as some people that have some contradictions in their performance, because they say they are not dealing with objective moral values, but in fact they are, because you could not do politics without
because
presupposing it.
Yes.
Actually, Plato would go further and say you couldn't speak, you couldn't use language if not presupposing the existence of those values.
And that's and that's the limit toward which he pushes it when he talks about Protagoras' secret doctrine in the Protagoras, that you would not have any communication, and that the thesis is self-refuted. Yes, I agree. I mean, it's and that's I think why I also said that it's interesting to see how Protagoras does not implement the nomos physis distinction, how he kind of anticipates Aristotle's construal of human beings as political animals. If it wasn't Plato who is writing the dialogue, maybe he would say, well, I agree, except, and that makes a big difference, there is nothing transcendental. Which through experience and through our common life, that we agree on what is more useful for us and what we need to implement in order to survive in the polis, not on the campus of the academy also. And then Plato would say, yes, but we want the campus in order to go back to the polis, and not everybody can judge. And there Protagoras, I guess, wouldn't have a very compelling answer, in the sense that there is no education. The only education you have is by practicing justice when you man the courts and you decide what you do. That's already very important, but if you realize that you need someone like Protagoras and you pay a lot of money to him to teach you, then these people will be better equipped to do that. And it's interesting that Plato never says, oh, but this is not just, because the poor will not be able to perform in the same way as those who went to the Ivy League schools. That's not something that Plato cares about. And that's not something that Protagoras cares about either in the text, because
They were all rich.
well, they were relatively rich to be able to afford to go and to participate, especially before they got money for jury duty. But I mean, the kind of money that the sophists charged was a lot of money. So I don't know how to approach this. Some of these writings, like Tell's articles in this Cambridge Companion to the Sophists, have a more sociological twist. They talk about Bourdieu in this context. It's interesting to raise this question in connection to the Athenian democracy and how democratic it ended up being. Yes, Gabriele.
Thank you. So thank you very much. It's very, you brought us through a very instigating route between this text. I have two very brief comments that I would like to see what you think. You made me feel that, so the question between physis and nomos can only come in an open society, using pauper against pauper in a way. Because you need the Mediterranean intercourse of civilizations, languages, traditions, to question that your own culture is not natural, for example, or something like that. So I think, especially when you compare this guy, when you think that they were looking at Spartan politics as something very different. You know, so Sparta has a different kind of relationship between individual and politics, army and democracy. And so they will think, okay, we have to discuss what is natural, what is not natural. And I think we haven't stressed, especially in days like this we are living, how important is this clash and encounter of civilization to question your own civilization. So that's my first... and the second thing, very briefly, is that when you mentioned that, so Plato and many of them, they have a solution which is education, of course. But what do you think about this wonderful passage of the two cities in Republic, where they say, you know, if you don't understand that the chess plate, you know, if you don't understand that you have this game of the two cities, the city of the rich and the city of the poor, you don't know nothing about politics. So in a way, I think that Plato, and maybe these guys also, they know that education is a way, but they're really thinking about economy also. So, you know, you have to think about how to do things rich. So they are all rich people, all rich guys.
Relying on poor ones, yeah?
Yes,
like we do.
but they know that the economies are a problem already. They know that you have to stress in your solution that if you keep most of the population poor, something will not work.
But
what do you think about that?
I think that I have to think about it, but how do you connect this with the nomos physis thing?
No, it's just because in a way you
because I
you
brought
start
in the question of education. Yes.
So the education will be the solution,
yes.
but actually they are trying to, for example, put some because when you think about the philosopher ruler as someone that has to withdraw from all the money, all the properties, and you think about something that it's ethical in a way. It's a way of educating yourself to put the justice before everything else. But it is also a political thing, being, without property. You know what I mean? It could be, as the oldest colleagues from even from Anglo-Saxons, it could be really a communist idea also, that could be part of the discussion of the solution of this nomos physis thing. So the gig is ring
I mean,
is an economic thing.
Yeah, that's where greed enters the question, and it is instructive actually to read the Republic against the scandal of the 30 tyrants. So what if these guys had realized that pursuing your appetites means that you're sick and you need to see someone about that? And that's what Plato does. He develops his psychology and he says, you should do that, something like that, because that's not you. It's your belly, it's your appetites, but it's not your real psyche. And that's why greed is an important point of departure for Plato's Republic, and this love for wealth, which he wants to resist. About the open society, it is, I think, instructive to think that theoria itself originates from a religious context where people would go abroad and see what Brazil is like and go back and be able to have this communication and I guess admire, wonder. That's what Solon does. He goes outside Athens and sees other things, and this gives you a different perspective. That's what Herodotus does. He's not making fun of other people, and this is not a given. There is nothing xenophobic about that, and this is something that we should, I think, draw inspiration from. Instead of saying, how are we going to close our borders? These guys are dangerous. He wants to embrace the otherness. And that's, in a sense, what Antiphon, I think, allows you to do also, and question, what does it mean to talk people saying that this is barbaric? Isn't this barbaric itself? It's a huge topic, not something that some of you may have ideas on this, so if there are questions or, again. But I guess there is a reason why we still admit that it is anachronistic to use the word enlightenment to talk about this tradition, but then we understand how meaningful it is to see that through this category. Renato.
No, I just want to mention on the themes of greed, politics and democracy, that Athenian democracy was imperialist since the very beginning, wasn't it? And it seems to me that Plato could see that, and that's why he relates
exactly.
the idea of greed and wanting more with democracy, because even the Athenian democracy was imperialist since the very beginning.
Absolutely, and that's, I think, a very attractive reading of the beginning of the Republic. Also, that you have this challenge, this Piraeus as emblematic of the opening to the sea, of the imperialist Athens. We have all this economy, the investors like Cephalus. And then what? Did we use this comfort for thinking? Yeah. But just to make sure that we are on the same page, what I said yesterday was that I see Plato drawing on Thucydides and projecting this kind of discussion on the sophists to make them look inferior to Socrates and then tell his own story. which is unfair, but it's fair also because it gives us a nice narrative. And to some extent, I guess, many of the sophists didn't bother to give this kind of, and to go back to what Gabriele said about openness, much of what those skills were about was diplomacy. To understand, or not even to understand, to put up, to tolerate the other's point of view. You were not going to impose democracy everywhere. But you had to understand, and that's why you had to understand the constitutions of other places. That's what Thrasymachus was an expert on, we are being told. Ili, yes.
Just an observation about democracy. I may be wrong, but I think after Pericles' death, Athens will have another kind of democracy, which is called holocracy, and it's different from the democracy of the.
Yes, many would agree with you. Plato wouldn't. I
And
guess he thought that Pericles was already a problem.
And I think this new democracy is the one Plato is
Dealing
against.
with, yes.
And it's very different. The Melian question, the Melian
Dialogue.
dialogue, no, the Melian, you talked yesterday about.
Yes, the millions, the Athenians addressed the
Yeah,
millions, yes.
That happened under this new democracy, and not with Pericles, because Pericles was
Teaching the crowd.
No, I have a word, I lost the word. Amazing.
I guess,
knew how to
Thucydides could be more
conduct.
sympathetic to that than Plato, I believe, because Plato in the Gorgias makes Pericles the origin of the democracy as he sees it.
But we see when we read the discourse, Pericles' discourse,
Yeah.
that he could conduct very well the mass differently from the people of
Yes,
the
yes,
new
yes.
democracy. I'm sorry, my English is horrible.
Well, the problem is that it's not our English. It's somebody else's English, and we try to communicate in that. Yeah, I don't know if you are familiar with this book by Harvey Eunice, Taming Democracy, which is one of the first, I think, books in English at least, to highlight Plato's debt to Thucydides and how important it is to take into consideration Thucydides when we try to reconstruct this story. Another question there.
Just to go back to the nomos physis point, I was just remembering that Herodotus, he quotes Pindar.
He does, yes.
And Plato does as well in the
Yeah,
Gorgias.
in Callicles.
It's
Yeah,
the same
Nomos
of
Vasileus.
Nomos Kings.
Yeah.
And I think there is a kind of a trajectory on the way people perceived the problem, if it is a problem, in the sense that even on Sophocles, it's something to be investigated. It's like, what is this thing with nomos that we are doing? And eventually you get to this sort of right or wrong position. And this seems to me to be a simplification of a very fruitful investigation that ends up in a dead end. Or some kind of a condemnation, like nomos must be bad in a way. And even in the part you brought up, when Hippias is saying we are all the same by nature, like we are superior to everyone.
Exactly.
We don't let this idea of nomos
Yeah.
take away from what we have.
Yeah.
So it gets political in the bad way.
Yes, but it could be political in the good way,
Yes,
like just the fact that you have the wrong kind of passport doesn't make you any inferior. And I think that you can see this line in Antiphon.
I thought there was I don't know if you would agree with this. There's a kind of there's a performative side to the way he presented the distinction.
Yes, I agree. I completely agree. Yes,
Yes,
and much of this could be performative, and then Plato isolates it and starts and presents it as something very problematic. And it's true. I mean, performances can be problematic. They amuse people, but it doesn't mean that that you scrutinize them. And even to go back to the beginning of the Republic, when it's interesting to see how Cephalus is presented as someone who enjoys Socrates' company because it's fun. But that's not the idea Plato wants to show. You know, it's not about fun. Things can be difficult, and you will soon lose your fortune and your son, is what people are expected to see when they read. They know exactly. So it's part of Plato's performance also. It's not in the text, but it's what people feel, and it's as powerful as, maybe more powerful than the argument of the Republic itself. When you have the Cephalus conformism, you know, I have money, I don't care, I enjoy talking with Socrates, but that's not enough. I don't know if doing mathematics is enough, but I hope not. Others? Yes, please.
Yeah, all right. I'll try to elaborate, to put this in English language, like I'm not very accustomed.
In this
to.
language, which
But
it doesn't belong to us. Yes.
Yes. But about the semi-quarrel between physis and nomos, about the point of view of Plato himself. Let me see what I got here. Like in the Cratylus, he clearly states that the origins of the names are from the name makers, the nomathetai.
Very good.
And and he puts up this hypothesis like to strike completely strike the name makes down right in the same dialogue, more in advance. So, yeah, it basically say that the names are very arbitrary, the name makes us as fallible as us, the names are not divine, and that's very close to what is stated in the 70 letter about the fact that like what's called nowadays a line, it can be a curve yesterday and vice versa. So yeah, the names are very arbitrary, and I don't think that just by the names, because like names are arbitrary, but like the laws of costume, the mora that Cicero so much complains about, or temporal mores, what are they? Are based in costume. What you see on the streets, what you see your parents doing, what you see the big ones doing. So yeah, I think Plato would see that kind of law based on custom also as an imperfect image to embase anything much greater. So yeah, a very pessimistic view on the nomos thing. And about the nature, yeah, on the Phaedo, if I don't mistake, that's the name, English name.
Yeah. Phaedon in modern Greek, yes.
All right.
Different customs, yeah.
Yeah, he has that passage that all professor right there so much like to cite over and over. That's he suggests that one who wants to reach the truth about the essence of the things in itself should take a shelter on the logoi, on the discourse, on the definitions.
Yeah.
So yeah.
But
Let me
do
see.
you connect this with names, though? No.
with names, I'll get there. So just,
Is this
just
what
make
people in
the
Brasilia
connection.
do? No.
So yeah, and that also goes with the Platonic definition of the, not just Platonic, but overall Socratic aim from that old maxim from Delos that one should know themselves. So, yeah. And there's that very interesting paper by, it's not a paper, it's a full book by, let me see the name, by the Elisa Gregory Wilkins, Know Thyself in Greek and Latin Literature, that states that the auto-knowledge is not what nowadays is what we mean by auto-knowledge, that psychological thing that you know your personality and all, but to know thyself in Greece is to know your role in society. You know your nature, you know what you ought to do, your role. So something very Platonic. So yeah. And if you would take this and connect with the Aristotelic definition of the man being by nature a communitary, a political animal,
Yeah.
and that which the same philosophers said about the main difference from man from another animals being the logos, because other animals have voices, have phoneme, but they
But it's
don't have.
humans who have.
Yeah, logos.
Yeah.
So yeah, if we take this all in account, we can say basically that what Plato is proposing by the taking a shelter on the logos is a medium from knowing thyself, from knowing your place in society by knowing the very nature of that which is justice, because justice is like each one make what is its role, make and
we don't have
nothing
much
else. But
time, maybe, but
yes.
I will make some comments. I mean, it's a lot of input,
Yeah.
and I
Sorry.
would like to hear what this Brazilian paradigm on logo is in the Fido, knowing knowing the gnosis of tone, and in connection with. I mean, there is something democratic there, maybe participatory and everything. I don't know. I don't know if this is what Plato thinks, because those logoi are semi-transcendental in the Phaedo. So I think it's a big. I'm not even sure what exactly you are claiming there. For the connection with logoi. For the connection with names and nomo in Kratilos, very interesting story. We don't know where this comes from. I mean, the closest earlier source I can think of is, again, the Hippocratic on the nature of man, which talks about nomos and physis and connects naming with nomos, to talk about the nature of man. Nothing political there, just about words and how language, what's the word, separates the categories. Very, very interesting stuff.
Yeah, yes,
but it doesn't. We don't see it anywhere else. I think we see it in the Kratilos, and I think it's. Sometimes it is said that this is where the nomos physis originates in, but I don't think it's the case, because it doesn't.
but like in the end, I think that all of the Platonic deliberation about knowledge, about the right opinion, it is aimed at the political project, aren't they? So like all of that talk about what's right, from what's a right front from you to extract your knowledge, whether it's the name, the things in itself, the logo. All that ends up guiding the, pavimenting the path of the politician that will take the policy. So, yeah, I think there is a political aspect for this deliberation.
One last thing, however, I mean, as I said, it's a big discussion. I would not put so much trust on the seventh letter in connection to Cratylus. I mean, it shows that there is this discussion, but I mean, I would be a little suspicious about using the seventh letter in the same context.
Okay.
Okay?
Okay.
I think so,
Well,
but we will have some time over lunch also, maybe.
Yes, thank you so much, Chloe, for your talk. Então, nós encerramos. Então, temos agora uma pausa para o almoço e depois nós voltamos a partir das 2h com a mesa redonda, né, do projeto Politeia. Obrigada.
Yes. How convenient.
How convenient.